Hey, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Here I am, a little bit of a delay in starting, but that's okay. Glad you're all here. We're going to have yet another great late night conversation, much later than usual, but that's okay. So yeah, let's do it. Let me put on the opening music, and we will go from there. We will go from there. So thanks, everybody.
Spoken of the Americans, I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Hey there, everybody. How you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, we're doing a late night chat, like we always do. So I'm looking forward to it. It'll follow our normal format: opening remarks, roll call, then I answer your questions for the remainder of the show. So if you've got something you would like me to touch on in the second half of the program, all you need to do is buy me a coffee. If you're on Rumble, you can send me a Rumble rant. If you're on Cash App, you can Cash App me at CalebMoppa22. But the best way to, get me to talk about something would be to buy me a coffee. And a couple people have already done that. Richard's already done it. John has already done it. So you'll be answered. You'll be the first ones, obviously. But yeah, buy me a coffee is the best way to do it. As far as announcements, we are building for a very important event coming up in New Jersey. It is the Earth is Awakening, America Should Join, kicking off 2026 event. I've got a lot on my plate about organizing this event, but it's going to be good. It's really, really going to be a good event, and I'm very, very excited about it. Good things are happening, and, I was just getting the banners arranged for today and on the phone and different aspects of the event. So if you're going to come to the event, please register so we know you're coming. We can get the right amount of food and all that important stuff. It's going to be good. So I'll see you there. There's the Eventbrite page to register. It's going to be a great, great event to kick off the year of 2026. Working on my end of the year message where I go over everything that we've done in the year. And boy, is it going to be a long message this year. Woo, we have done so much. I mean, we are really getting stuff done. So that's what I'm up to. That's the big announcement we got. So yeah, for tonight, we are following our same usual format. So opening remarks, then the roll call, then I answer your questions for the remainder of the night. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of the program, all you need to do is send me a Rumble rant or Cash App me at CalebMoppa22, or best, buy me a coffee. Buy me a coffee. Welcome, everybody. So I thought tonight, since there's a lot of things going on in the world, things are very much in flux, right? I mean, that new national security strategy of the United States is pretty great. And there's talk of negotiations, and, the war in Ukraine could soon be coming to an end. It looks like, Zelensky is on his way out of Ukraine. Like, a lot of things are happening. And the USA has not bombed Venezuela either, which is amazing. I'm really glad to see that it hasn't happened. Still hoping it de-escalates, but there has not, as of yet, been any attack on Venezuela, which is good as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of great things are potentially happening. A lot of things are up in the air. So rather than give a huge amount of analysis of that tonight, I thought I would kind of answer a question that might seem like common sense to some people, but is actually a really important question, which is why organize? Why organize? Why be an activist? Why be involved in any of this? And there was a time in my life where I would have thought this was a ridiculous question. But I'm actually at this point realizing that it's actually one of the most important questions, because the overwhelming majority of people who agree with the kind of thing we talk about on here about the imperialists and the war makers and the dying Western system and the rising New World in the East, the overwhelming majority of people who have this perspective don't do anything about it. And it's not that they are lazy or bad people, it's they don't know that they can do anything about it, right? It doesn't even occur to them that one could do anything about it, right? The idea that this is anything other than a spectator sport or an intellectual intrigue is just not something they're aware of. And that's not their fault, honestly. I mean, there is very, very, very little knowledge of social movements. There's just not much knowledge of them. People don't know that they exist, and they don't know what social movements do. And we live in an age where what used to be kind of common knowledge about social movements and how important they are is not widespread. However, at the same time that there's not knowledge of social movements and the roles that they play, there is a huge amount of wrecker culture or Khrushchevism. That's what I wrote the book Khrushchevism, about, was about wrecker culture and the psychology behind the wrecker culture that has developed. Right. That's basically, I used Khrushchev and his disastrous 20th Party Congress speech of 1956 as an example of wrecker culture and the wrecker culture that has developed in the West. And so at the same time that we've kind of lost knowledge of the importance of social movements, we have also at the same time, there's been a development of wrecker culture. And so I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about social movements, what they are. And at the same time, I'm going to talk a little bit about wrecker culture and where it came from and the problems. This is by no means a complete history of anything, right? I'm going to be all over the place tonight. I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, but, social movements. One common thing, and this may be shocking to some people, but I have actually met a number of people that are my age or younger who do not know what a labor union is. I am deadly serious. People who do not know what a labor union is. And actually, that's not uncommon, because nowadays the amount of workers in America that are members of labor unions is about 10%, and the overwhelming majority of that 10% are government employees. And government employees are not the reason that unions were formed. Unions were formed as a mechanism for workers advocating for their own interests against the interests of private employers who were utilizing their labor to make profits for themselves. They weren't intended to be a negotiation for how much of a taxpayer salary one would get. Now, I'm not against teachers having a union. I'm not against firefighters having a union, right? I think government employees deserve representation too. But the labor movement was not created to be a movement of government employees, public servants negotiating how much of our tax money they get in their paycheck. It was originally, the labor movement was created to be a movement of employees making demands upon their employers. And if it wasn't for labor unions, there would be no minimum wage. There would be certainly no one would ever even think of getting health care benefits. There would not be an 8-hour workday. And that has largely been lost. And one of the great ways that you can tell that knowledge of the labor movement has been forgotten is that I frequently hear politicians from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party say, we need good paying jobs to come back to America. Right? We've all heard this, right? They say we need good paying jobs in steel mills, jobs in auto plants to come back to America. And they say that. And it's good that they're saying that. That reflects what people want. People want good paying jobs. And the service sector gig economy that we've got certainly does not provide good paying jobs to young people. But there's nothing magical about working at a steel mill that makes it pay a lot of money. There's nothing magical about working in an auto plant that makes it pay a lot of money. There's nothing magical about working in a coal mine that makes it pay a lot of money. Industrial jobs are not magically more pay oriented than, than service sector jobs. There's nothing special. There's not like some, that people who work in service sector jobs, they just, and this is a myth. And a lot of people believe that, if you work at Starbucks and you serve coffee, you work at McDonald's and you're, asking people if they want fries with that, or running the fryer machine, that is just a wimpy job. But those steel workers, they're tough, strong men, and they're doing real man's work, and that's why they get paid more. That is not true. Right. And a lot of people believe that. Right. Or the same about coal miners. They say, well, those coal miners, that's tough, strong work coal men do. Very true. It is just like jobs in a steel mill, but there's no reason that they should pay you more for that. Right. The reason that workers in auto plants got very, very good wages and benefits and all of that was because of the auto workers unions. It was because of the sit down strikes and the CIO, the rise of the CIO. The reason that steel workers make really good money, that's because of the militancy of the steel workers union. And read about the Little Steel Strike of 1937. And read about what eventually how hard it was to get the steel workers unionized. And the reason that industrial jobs in America paid a lot of money and still do is because unions went out and fought for that. And if you go back to the 1920s and 30s, when there were a lot of immigrants coming into this country from Ireland and from Italy and from Eastern Europe, and those steel mills and those auto plants and those meat packing facilities were full of workers who made poverty wages and lost arms and legs on the job and got no compensation. And it was the industrial union movement that won those high wages. And it started in the Roosevelt administration. You had the rise of the CIO, where workers occupied their factories, sat down, and refused to leave. And there was a division in the ruling class. And the president of the United States, Roosevelt, was on their side because he feared a fascist coup. And as a result of that, the CIO emerged. Originally, the labor unions would not organize industrial workers. They only organized skilled workers, right? The American Federation of Labor was the first big labor union federation in this country, AFL, and they refused to organize anyone who did not have an apprenticeship, right? If your job didn't have an apprenticeship, if you didn't have to go through a process of getting certified, they wouldn't organize you. They would not organize unskilled workers or industrial workers. And it wasn't until the rise of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, in 1937, 1938, during the second term of President Roosevelt, that you got unions. And even then, the pay in those jobs, it improved when they had unions, but it wasn't really until after the Second World War that you got the really, really good wages for auto workers, the really, really good wages for steel workers, et cetera. They got good pay. Those guys were making decent salaries. And the reason they were making those decent salaries was because of the fact that they had unions. And after the Second World War, the rest of the world, the rest of the industrialized Western world had been destroyed. And the world was buying its steel and buying its cars and buying its electronics from America. And so there was a huge profit margin. And as a result, the unions had more leverage. And it was the post-World War II strike wave of 1946, 1947, that ultimately, that's when auto workers in America started making really, really good money. That's when steel workers in America started making really, really good money. And people don't know that, right? And people just think that it's magic. They just think, well, a steel worker, he's a hardworking man, and so that's why, and that's not the case. And then people also will say, well, it's really hard to get one of those jobs. That's true. It's really hard to get a job at a steel mill. You have to know somebody, right? To get a job at an auto plant. There are so few auto plants left in America. It's hard to get. So they say, well, that's what it is. It's like those jobs are so good paying, so there's not as many of them. Well, no, what it is that nowadays, the largest eliminator of industrial jobs has been machinery, technology, right? A steel mill that used to employ thousands can employ less than a couple hundred nowadays. It's been machinery, but also offshoring. Now it's much cheaper due to technology to make products in different countries. You can have a product that's made in many different countries, whereas before generally a product had to be made in one country. So offshoring and playing workers in different countries against each other and all of that's a new factor. But it's primarily technology has been the biggest job killer in industry. And those jobs that do exist, they get decent pay because they have union representation. And those companies have signed contracts with unions that will strike and will demand higher wages. And people don't know this. People have no idea. But it's because workers occupied their factories. It's because of unions and strikes and people standing up to company thugs on the picket line. And you read about the history of organized labor in America. It was a social movement. It was a social movement. It was not voting. It was not voting, right? There were cases where unions went out and campaigned for candidates that were more sympathetic to them. I think the first political action committee that was ever created was the CIO PAC, the CIO Political Action Committee. So they did get involved in elections, but it was largely industrial action. It was direct action on the job of workers refusing to go to work and other workers refusing to cross the picket line, and labor unions building up support in the community, and strikes and workplace occupations and lockouts, and a whole history that got us a situation where industrial jobs pay decent wages. And again, that history is not out there. The best book I have ever read on this topic, by far, if you want to read a really good readable book on the history of the labor movement, it's called Labor's Untold Story. It's a book published by the United Electrical Workers. And it's called Labor's Untold Story by Richard O'Boyer and Herbert Moraes. It's a really, really good book. I'll put the cover of it on the screen. If you ever get a chance to read Labor's Untold Story, you will learn about the history, not of people, you'll learn about the history of a social movement, right? That's what you're going to learn. You're going to learn the history of a social movement. And it was a social movement that enabled those good paying jobs. And so when people say we need to bring those jobs back, it's like they wouldn't be good paying jobs if it wasn't for struggle. And there's no reason that, jobs that we have now can't be decent, right? If the workers at McDonald's had a union and they forced McDonald's into a situation where it had to recognize their union, where it had to negotiate with the union and pay them a decent wage, you could very, very easily have a situation where McDonald's workers made about the same amount of money that steel workers make. And you laugh, but you might laugh and say, that's crazy. Why would somebody, I've worked in McDonald's before. Why? It's hot, it's difficult, it's stressful. You got to deal with the public. Why shouldn't a McDonald's worker walk away at the end of the day with a large paycheck, right? The Kroc family certainly makes a huge amount of money. Why shouldn't somebody who works 40 hours a week at McDonald's take home enough of a paycheck to feed their family and put their kids through school? Why not, right? What is so undignified about McDonald's labor that it is unworthy of the same pay if somebody works in a steel mill, right? But you have to understand it's because of social movements. It's because of organized labor. It's because of strikes. Another thing that people are often unaware of, right, is that people don't seem to understand what the civil rights movement was, right? A lot of people think the civil rights movement was once upon a time, this guy named Dr. Martin Luther King had a march on Washington, and all these people gathered in Washington, and he said, I have a dream. And everyone cried, and it was just so moving. And then they passed the Civil Rights Act, and that's what happened. Well, that's not what happened, right? What happened was that, black people have been fighting for their rights ever since they came here. There were constant slave revolts and slave uprisings, Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, etc. And there was a black liberation movement going back to, immediately after slavery was abolished. You had Black Wall Streets, you had efforts to build black-owned businesses, black empowerment. You had Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement that was kind of a black nationalist separatist movement. But really, you didn't get the modern civil rights movement until after the Second World War. And what happened was, after the Second World War, there was something called the Civil Rights Congress that was a legal wing of the Communist Party. The Communist Party of the United States, they were very, very anti-racist. They had fought for the Scottsboro Nine, which were a group of black men falsely charged with rape during the 1930s. And the communists had championed opposition to Jim Crow segregation. But after the Second World War, the Communist Party of the United States, they formed the Civil Rights Congress. And the Civil Rights Congress was involved in trying to expose how the death penalty was being used in the South. That was their main focus, was that basically if you were a black person in the South and you were charged with an offense like rape, like murder, you got the death penalty automatically. You didn't have a chance because all the jurors would be white. They didn't let black people serve on juries, and they didn't care. And that there were many black men who got the death penalty for crimes that didn't take place, right? There was a case where like a 13-year-old boy kissed a white girl on the cheek, and they charged him with rape and gave him the death penalty. And it's like he never raped anybody. There was no rape that ever took place. And there were a lot of cases like that, where basically if a black man was on trial, he got the death penalty. He got killed. And if he didn't get extrajudicially lynched, he just got killed. And the Civil Rights Congress was this organization founded by the Communist Party. It was actually declared to be a communist front group by the U.S. Department of Justice. They actually made it illegal for them to give bail money to anybody. But the Civil Rights Congress was formed, and they went around providing lawyers to black men in the South that were charged with capital crimes. Because it was just, if you were a black man and you were charged with a crime, you would get the death penalty. And the Civil Rights Congress, because they were led by communists, their leader, William L. Patterson, who was a Communist Party member, he was invited to the United Nations by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union brought William L. Patterson to the United Nations, and they let him give a speech to the United Nations. And the speech was called "We Charge Genocide." And that speech is still available. You can read the entire text of it. And that speech was presented as an official United Nations speech because the Soviet Union was a UN Security Council member. They had a permanent voting status, and they read "We Charge Genocide" to the United Nations, accusing the U.S. government of genocide against black people, detailing lynching, detailing lack of access to medical care, all the crimes against black Americans and the conditions that they lived in America in the 1950s. 1951, the Soviet Union decided to use the United Nations to call out racism in America. And because of that, that had a big impact. And then the Communist Party, which was illegal at the time, it was an illegal organization, right? It had been broken up by the FBI, but they still existed, and they had tens of thousands of members. And they took copies of "We Charge Genocide," and they walked door to door in almost every black neighborhood in America and gave out copies of it and sold them for a nickel, for a dime. In some cases, they gave them away. And they just said, this is an official UN text talking about the treatment of black Americans. And it was from the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party went up and down every black neighborhood in Chicago, every black neighborhood in New York, every black neighborhood in Philadelphia. They went up and down this country, knocking on doors. I met old communists who'd been part of this, knocking on black people's doors and saying, "Hi, I'm from the Communist Party. Have you heard about this speech at the UN about what's happening to black people? And did you hear that the Soviet Union is talking at the United Nations about what's been done to black people?" And that had a big impact, and it scared the bejesus out of the FBI. The FBI tried to stop this, and they arrested people for doing it. They declared the Civil Rights Congress to be, a front for the Communist Party, which, it was basically. And they tried to get the Civil Rights Congress shut down, and they walked up and down this country doing this and selling "We Charge Genocide." And all of this led to a situation where the Democratic Party in the North, the urban political machines, the Democratic Party, felt like they had to do something about Jim Crow segregation. They feared that black people in America would revolt right? And Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were growing in popularity in northern urban centers. And Malcolm X was a black nationalist, but he was preaching support for Mao and support for African national liberation movements. And there was a real fear that communists would lead the black liberation movement. So, as a result of that, there was an incident in Chicago. It was in Mississippi, but in Mississippi, a young black teenager named Emmett Till was murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman. And when his dead body was brought back to Chicago, the funeral in Chicago turned into a really big event. And the mayor of Chicago, who was a very corrupt Democrat, Mayor Daley, had a press conference and went to the funeral. And he said, look at what's been done to this young African-American man for allegedly whistling at a white woman. This is wrong. And all kinds of Democratic politicians, including the Kennedy family and others, said, look at what happened to Emmett Till. This is wrong. And part of the reason they did that is because the Soviet Union was taking the image of Emmett Till and sending it all over the world and saying, America says it believes in democracy and freedom. Look what it does to black people. And you had Kwame Nkrumah, who was rising in popularity in Africa. Ghana was being led by a communist African socialist leader named Kwame Nkrumah. And the Soviet Union was funding the African National Congress to fight apartheid in South Africa. They were funding all kinds of black communist liberation organizations. And they were telling the black people, don't trust America when it says it respects your rights, when it says it wants to oppose colonialism. And they were using that image of Emmett Till's body to say that. And there was a fear on the part of the American government. First of all, they were saying that Jim Crow segregation and was hurting the image of the United States around the world. And second, there was a fear that black people might revolt under the leadership of communists and that they needed to do something to address the issue of racism in America. So after the murder of Emmett Till, a number of Democratic Party politicians, the Kennedy family in Boston and all kinds of Democratic Party politicians had vigils to commemorate Emmett Till, to support Emmett Till's mother. And then a year later, they found Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, and they had him lead the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was a really big deal because the black community in Montgomery, Alabama, depended on public transportation. But they made a big effort. A huge mobilization was done. It was funded by the United Auto Workers Union, which had banned communists a year before. But the United Auto Workers Union and the northern wing of the Democratic Party decided that they were going to demand an end to segregation on the buses, the public bus system of the city of Montgomery, Alabama. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a young minister who became the charismatic face of that. And that's how the civil rights movement really got going. It was a result of the Communist Party. It was a result of the Soviet Union, and we charged genocide. It was a result of the murder of Emmett Till. And all of that one thing led to another. And what did Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. do? He organized protests, illegal protests, civil disobedience. They would break the law. Right? They would go into restaurants for whites only, and they would sit down at the lunch counter, which was illegal, and demand to be seated, and the police would arrest them and beat them up and drag them out. Right? And that the civil rights movement was not one day Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech, the end. It was a lot of people giving their lives to a movement and getting arrested and getting beaten up and working with people with whom they did not always agree, and getting things done, and organizing big demonstrations, and organizing rallies, and taking risks, and getting arrested. And it led to, ultimately, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, etc. And people don't know this history. People think that it just happened. They don't get it. Just like with the labor movement. They think there's something magical about steel workers. And the conditions of black Americans are not great. I'm not saying racism was solved by this by any means, but I'm telling you that it took a real social movement. And if it wasn't for for the Civil Rights Congress, and if it wasn't for William L. Patterson, and if it wasn't for the Soviet Union, and if it wasn't for Emmett Till and his mother having the open casket, none of this would have developed. And then what did develop was a mass movement of people getting arrested. They used to have the Freedom Summers, where they would go to Mississippi and thousands of people would get arrested. Black and white would get arrested intentionally to draw attention to the issue of civil rights, and that it was a mass movement. It was a mass movement, and that this is something people are not aware of. And mass movements are not just a modern phenomenon. Obviously, we think about the labor movement. That's something that developed, as we had the modern industrial system of factory owners, factory workers. The civil rights movement is something that largely became considered to be a general trend as a result of post-World War II America. Obviously, there's been Black liberation struggles here since Black people ever came here, but the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s is obviously something very new. But social movements are long-standing, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. I wrote this book, Khrushchevism, to talk about wrecker culture. And when I wrote this book, I had to read Eric Hoffer. Eric Hoffer wrote True Believer, which is a book opposing social movements. It's a book that says that social movements are bad, basically. And I read this book, and he goes after social movements and describes them as totalitarian, as mind control, as cults. And I read Eric Hoffer's book, and what Eric Hoffer says is he says, that there are certain people who just can't make it in the religious, institutions. They just can't, rise up the ranks of the traditional priesthood. There's some people who just can't make it as standard writers and academics in the university system or whatever. There's some people who just can't make it in the regular political system and the regular political parties. So basically they cheat. They cheat by forming mass movements. They form mass movements and they cheat. They're cheating. Right? And that these people, they just suck. They just suck. They're just not good enough to be a regular priest. They're not good enough to be a regular politician. They're not good enough to be a regular writer or speaker. And so they cheat. They cheat and they form a mass movement. They go outside of the prevailing institutions. It's not like there could be anything wrong with the religious system that exists. Not like there could be anything wrong with the political parties, the political institutions that exist. Not like there could be anything wrong with the prevailing academic institutions or whatever. No. It's just that these people they just are not good enough. And so they cheat. They go outside. And instead of just rising up the ranks the way you're supposed to, what they do is they form a mass movement. And that's cheating. It's cheating. It's not allowed. And that's what Eric Hoffer argues in his book. And he says that mass movements are very convenient because you can blame other people for your problems, right? He says that if a mass movement is a communist or a socialist movement, you can blame the rich people, blame the social system. If it's a racist movement, you can blame other races and nationalities, blame the Black people, blame the Jews, blame whoever, right? He says if it's a religious movement, you can blame the devil and Satan, right? But it's a way that people can blame other people for their problems. And he says the most recruitable people to mass movements are the newly poor. The newly poor, people that used to have money and then their conditions got worse, right? The newly poor, and that these cheaters, these redundant people who just aren't good enough to make it in the prevailing institutions of society, they start movements that help people blame other people for their problems, and they recruit the newly poor to join their movements, and they build these mass movements. And Eric Hoffer is basically arguing mass movements are bad. What's interesting, though, is that one of the examples of a mass movement he points to is Christianity, right? We all think communism is a mass movement. The Ku Klux Klan, racism, Nazism, fascism is a mass movement. But Eric Hoffer, he says Christianity is one of the first mass movements. I thought that was kind of interesting. And that's why his book was considered to be pretty edgy at the time it was published, as Eric Hoffer sees Christianity in the same way as he sees communism or fascism, as a mass movement that is made by redundant people, right? He argues, why, if Jesus was really a good religious leader, he would have just joined the priesthood. But instead, he built a mass movement. He cheated, right? If the Apostle Paul was really such a good writer, he would have become a famous writer in the Roman institutions. But instead, he cheated and he formed a mass movement. If the masses of poor people in the Roman Empire, if they were really, really smart people, they would have become wealthy landowners. But instead, they formed a mass movement, right? I mean, this is the mindset. It's actually very similar to what Friedrich Nietzsche argued, right? Friedrich Nietzsche looked at Christianity and communism. He said they're the same thing. They're the doctrine of the downtrodden, right? He said the doctrine of the lowly makes for lowliness, right? And he called it slave morality, slave religion, slave morality. But Eric Hoffer, I mean, he's talking about the fact that that mass movements generally are formed outside of the prevailing institutions. And they're made by people who are rejected by the prevailing institutions. The leaders of mass movements tend to be people that are rejected and don't fit in with the prevailing institutions. And they build mass movements and they tend to recruit newly poor people. When conditions are getting worse in society and people are going from having something to not having something, the newly poor generally are not happy and they want to do something about it. And mass movements give voice to them. Well, my question for Eric Hoffer isn't it a bit of a problem if society has all these newly poor people who are recruited? Doesn't that mean something's wrong? And generally, wouldn't most of those newly poor people prefer to address it through the traditional political institutions, through the traditional religions, through the traditional writers, and through the traditional academic and intellectual voices? But it looks like if you have a situation where there's all kinds of newly poor people being created, and those newly poor people don't get the answers they're looking for, or the solutions they're looking for from the prevailing political, religious, or intellectual institutions. And so they turn to these mass movement leaders. That says there's a problem in society now, doesn't it? Right? If everyone was randy dandy and happy, they would not listen to the organizers of mass movements. They would just vote for the regular political parties. They would just attend the regular religious institutions. They would just listen to the prevailing intellectual voices. But the reason that people are listening to the leaders of mass movements is because they are newly poor and they are unsatisfied and they're not getting the answers and solutions from the prevailing institutions, right? And that's why mass movements are created. And that doesn't seem to occur to Eric Hoffer. It's not that society could be wrong. It's that mass movements are dangerous and totalitarian, and they always lead to bloodshed and killing and death, right? And Eric Hoffer is kind of the original wrecker, right? It's this belief that mass movements are inherently totalitarian, that the masses of people, when they get involved, are very, very dangerous. And that mindset, that is the basis of philosophical irrationalism. Friedrich Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, Leo Strauss, anti-populism. Right. And that is very, very widespread. And what you can call wreckerism, I would say, is a big problem. Right. In our time, there used to be an understanding that a lot of people had that mass movements were a good thing. Great example of this, right? There is a very old television show from before I was born in the 1970s. It was called All in the Family. And it was, it was about the conflict between a young hippie and his stepfather, Archie Bunker. The hippie was Meathead, played by Rob Reiner, and the stepfather was Archie Bunker. And Archie Bunker was a racist. And it's this family that lives in New York City. The young guy is Meathead, who's a young hippie. And the stepfather is Archie Bunker, notorious racist. And there is a particular moment on one of those episodes, right, where I guess, one of Meathead's, relatives or friends or whatever has been arrested at a protest. And so Archie Bunker says to Meathead, he says to him, "Oh, I can't believe these young protesters out there being violent, disrespecting our police." And then Archie Bunker's wife says to him, "Well, Archie, you were violent on the picket line." Because Archie Bunker is a construction worker. And Archie Bunker, this notoriously racist, conservative dad figure on the show, she says, "You were violent on the picket line." And then Archie says to his wife, "Well, you've got to teach a scab a lesson." And she says, "Yeah, by bashing their heads in." And the point is that even deeply conservative construction worker racist dad caricatures, in this 1970s cartoon, understood that labor unions were a good thing and that picket lines were to be defended. And apparently this fictional character who's supposed to represent your average racist American dad, had defended a picket line, had no problem with not only being in a union, going on strike, but actually bashing people's skulls in if they tried to cross the picket line. Now, that nothing like that would be on TV now because that's not there. But even back in the 70s, right, even among deeply conservative Americans, there was an understanding that social movements were good on some level, right? Archie Bunker might have been opposed to the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was very opposed to the anti-racist movement. He was quite racist himself. But the labor movement, that's what you did if you were a construction worker. And even now in New York City, the construction workers unions are still in effect. They're quite strong. They're not as strong as they once were. But, there was a feeling that social movements were a good thing. It's also very interesting. When I was a kid, there, in the town I grew up in a very little town in Ohio. There was very little knowledge of social movements. People might have seen stuff about civil rights on TV. And there was a union. The teachers were in unions, and there were factories that had unions. But generally, there wasn't much knowledge of social movements. A lot of people I went to school with didn't know what a union was, things like that. And it was there were many people I went to school with that thought anyone who protested was crazy. And I remember this, and this is interesting. You don't see this anymore. And this really changed with the Tea Party. When I was growing up, there was a belief that if you protest anything, you are a bad person. Because protesting and they also thought it was illegal because they hear about protesters being arrested on the news. And many people thought that all protesters are crazy and it's illegal. If you protest, you go to jail immediately, right? They didn't understand that protesters get arrested for blocking roads. Protesters they just hear that protesters arrested, which is what you see on TV. And so they assume that means that it is illegal to protest. And they also thought that protesters were bad. There was this whole culture. When I was a kid, we were all taught about Forrest Gump. Not about Forrest Gump. We were all taught a narrative from the movie Forrest Gump or from the movie Rambo with Sylvester Stallone that during the Vietnam War, the soldiers came home and there were all these rude protester hippies who spit on them. And that's why you should never protest a war ever again. That was the attitude. And then I remember, I don't know if people remember, but there was this very, very anti-gay pastor from Kansas, Fred Phelps. And he was protesting the funerals of gay people. He did that for a while. And after a while, he wasn't getting much attention from that. But he was very, very opposed to homosexuality. So he started protesting the funerals of soldiers who died in Iraq. Right. He started protesting their funerals, saying that they had been killed because of homosexuality. The death of soldiers in Iraq was God's punishment for homosexuality. This guy would have signs that said, "God hates fags." Not a nice guy. Fred Phelps. And Fred Phelps, he protested Ronald Reagan's funeral. And his sign said, "Reagan is in hell." And he thought Reagan was too pro-LGBT. And I remember when I was in high school, I had arguments with my classmates. People told me they thought Fred Phelps was a, quote, hippie and that Fred Phelps was a leftist. I said, well, no, he's not. Fred Phelps is a church pastor. He's against gay marriage, just like you are. And they said, but he's protesting and only leftists protest, only hippies, only anti-American people protest. And I remember having that argument. And there was just a belief that anyone who protested anything was crazy, right? And that was just kind of a belief. That changed, though, with the rise of the Tea Party. And I remember actually when I was in college, when the Tea Party started, Obama became president, you started having Tea Party protests. There was a woman who was part of my college the College Republicans Club at my college. And And, I went to a small college. Everybody knew everybody else. And she'd been vice president of the college Republicans. So I remember one time I rode the bus. And she was actually riding the bus also. And I remember I said to her, hey, are you still in the college Republicans club? And she frowned and she said, no. And I said, why not? And she said, I'm not a protester. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, now that's what college Republicans are supposed to do. We're supposed to go out and protest and, wear, protest and have, founding father tri-cornered hats. And I don't like that. It's weird, right? I'm not a protester. Protest is not what you should do, right? I believe in voting. I don't believe in protesting. And that, that kind of threw Republican politics for a loop, because a lot of the conservative culture was only leftists protest, only radical leftist protest. And people who protest are crazy and you go to jail for protesting. Now, there was a small minority. There were some people that I went to school with that were evangelicals who protested abortion, right? And that there were a couple families that were like fundamental Baptists, and their church would actually have them go protest against abortion clinics and stuff like that. But for the most part, the attitude among middle American conservatives was that if you protest, you're crazy. And that was the attitude. And that changed with the Tea Party. So that changed and the culture kind of shifted. And now there is an understanding that one can be a conservative and protest. And there's all kinds of conservative protests nowadays. They didn't used to be. It's kind of interesting how these things play out. But what's interesting, though, is at the same time that there was this attitude among a lot of conservative middle America that one should not engage in social movements. One should not protest because that's dangerous. One part of American life that it was what you did. And it's still kind of like this in small towns, but not like it was, not especially since the pandemic, was everybody went to church. Everybody. And in fact, it was really common that, in middle America, like my family were Democrats. Everyone in our town were Republicans. My parents voted for the Democrats, but we went to church. We were part of the United Church of Christ. And every Sunday we went to church. And not only did we go to church, I went to church youth group on Sunday night. I went to Bible study classes on Wednesday night. And during the summertime, we would have Wednesday night meals at the church where there'd be programs afterwards. It was just what you did. You went to church. And my family was particularly liberal, and, but that's what you did. That's what people did. There was just this feeling that one should go to church. We did not go to a fundamentalist church. We did not go to an evangelical church. We didn't go knock on people's doors and try to convert them to our faith, but we went to church. And that in my little area, right, the church that I went to was a church that a lot of doctors and lawyers went to, and a lot of college educated people went to, because the expectation was you must go to church, but most of the churches in my town were quite conservative. So it was a place that one could have more, liberal beliefs and still go to church. And all across America, you have Unitarian Universalist churches, which are churches that basically you're allowed to be an atheist and be part of. But the reason they exist is because it's part of the culture that one must go to church. And in these little college towns in Kentucky and Indiana and places like that, the local college professor who doesn't believe in God or believes in like mystical Buddhism or whatever, he still has to go to church because that's what you do. And so everybody goes to church. And so they have Unitarian Universalist Church, which is a very, very liberal, open-minded church. Anything goes. They never quote the Bible and stuff like that, because part of the culture is that's what you do in middle America. Well, you never go to protests. Protesting is something we would never do. Well, everyone goes to church. But now we're kind of in a weird phase in our time where since the pandemic, right, church attendance in America is way down. Being in a church is a social movement. I mean, it's a conservative social movement, etc. But it's being active, right? You're joining a social movement. You're grouping with other people. You say you believe things, right? Church attendance is way down. And so is genuine activism. There's a huge amount of hashtag revolution. Hashtag revolution is not genuine activism. And I saw this during Occupy Wall Street. That was the very beginning of it. And since then, with the rise of Black Lives Matter, with the rise of whatever the latest thing is, we see a huge amount of what you call hashtag revolution, which is something goes viral on social media, protest about this issue, and people go there because they saw it on social media, and they go to the protest, it's on social media, and then they go home. There's no organization, there's no community, there's no ideology. It's just Twitter says, go here. This is the trendy liberal cause. We go there, we take pictures of ourselves. There's a big crowd because it's blasted all over social media. CNN is there to film it, and then we all go home. That's not a real social movement, right? That's a social media meetup, right? That's a flash mob, right? And that's what has kind of replaced social movements. The parties, the organizations, the labor unions, all these groups, they're disintegrating. But at the same time, there's hashtag revolution. Meanwhile, at the same time that that there is a decline in actual social movement, while you have hashtag revolution, there is actually a big decline in middle America. The people who would never protest, they have stopped going to church in large numbers, right? And instead, they listen to podcasts about Christianity at home, right? And that there is a huge, at the same time that there's kind of less interest in social movements, a big part of that, and there's just not knowledge of social movements. People don't know, right? Unless you are a communist, you don't know about the labor movement. You don't know about the civil rights movement and all. You don't know about that stuff and all the activism that people did. You think it just kind of happened, right? And unless you are, a very dedicated fanatical Christian, you don't know about, the martyrdom and the sacrifice and all of that. You'd think just Christianity just kind of happened. But at the same time, there's like no knowledge of social movements. There's also at the same time this huge celebration of wrecker culture, right? Which is like, there's a million YouTube videos about, I came across this thing and it was a scam. It was a fraud. It was a phony. A phony. Phony. It was fake. It wasn't real. And I thought to myself, should I expose this thing that is fake? But then I talked to my grandma, or I talked to my dog, or I looked at the eyes of my children, or I thought about this great historical moment, and I thought, it is my duty to expose this scam, this fraud, this fake thing. And so they get on social media and they expose the fraud and they tear down this thing. And they're a great hero. And we all look, they're the one that exposed the thing. They're the one that revealed the fraud. They're the one who tore it down. There was something built and it was no good. And they wrecked it. Good for them. Great for them. I applause, applause, applause. And so you have a whole layer of people who don't know what a social movement is. But they do, on the other hand, think that the way that one is heroic is you tear something down, right? And that, obviously scams exist. Obviously crime exists. Obviously fraud exists. But not everything is a scam. Not everything is a fraud. It's kind of like Me Too. Rape is rape. Rape is a very serious crime. You rape somebody, you're going to jail for decades, right? Sexual assault, very serious crime, right? Me Too is full of somebody made some unmade bad choices. There was an uncomfortable situation. He said, she said, we're not quite clear. There's no clear accusation of sexual assault. There's no clear accusation of anything. It's just kind of, and that's the thing. There is a huge difference between rape, sexual assault, and he made me uncomfortable, and that's not saying that there's never anything to that. There is definitely situations. Sexual harassment is a reality. You read about the first sexual harassment case that ever happened, the first sexual harassment lawsuit. It obviously does happen, but there's a big difference between sexual harassment and rape and sexual assault, but there isn't on the internet. On the internet, it's all the same, right? On the internet, it's all the same. And like the Louis C.K. case, right? Louis C.K., take example of that, right? Louis C.K., did he rape anybody? No. Did he sexually assault anybody? Technically, no. Because he did something that was gross, but every time he did it, before he did it, he said to the person, may I do this? And they said yes. So it wasn't sexual assault, right? If it's consensual, that is not sexual assault. Should he have done it? No, obviously, right? It was a gross thing to do. But Is Louis C.K. a rapist? No. Did he sexually assault anybody? No. He made a poor choice at work, and he did things in a workplace context that were wrong. And, he realizes that now, and he's apologized for that, and that's that. You know what I mean? But routinely, it's all over the internet. Louis C.K. is a rapist. No, he's not. Louis C.K. is a pedophile. I don't know how he's a pedophile. Everyone involved was at 18 years old. You look at the details. What Louis C.K. did, he shouldn't have done it. It was wrong. But it's not, and the internet is like that. And that's how this wrecker culture works, right? Everything's a scam. Everything's a fraud. Everything's a cult. Everything is evil, predatory. And it's like, there are things in this world that are not good. I spent my entire 20s and early 30s in communist groups. There are things in those communist groups that are not good, things that I'm genuinely mad about. My main criticism of them is their politics, though, is that they did not have an orientation of going to the masses of people. They didn't have an orientation of building a real mass movement, right? And they were loyal to the Democratic Party and its liberal agenda. And especially, they weren't really anti-imperialist. They left Libya out to dry. When Obama bombed and destroyed Libya, they did nothing, barely anything to stand with Libya. And that infuriated me. But, were there things in those communist groups that were, I don't know, I don't even know what the right word was. Were they authoritarian in ways I didn't appreciate? Sure. Were there deceptive things that went on? Yeah, to some degree. Do I feel that I was victimized by being in those groups? No. No, I do not. Right? No, I do not. I don't, and honestly, being in those groups saved my life. And I wouldn't be here talking to you if, communists had not pressured me to go out and sell newspapers on the street. Communists had not given me a place to feel confident and feel good about myself. I mean, I am really, really thankful that I found the communist movement, as much as the communist movement let me down, and as much as now we're pioneering something completely new. But I was part of, and I am still part of, social movements. And I think social movements are good. They are very, very good. And they helped me a huge amount. You look at me, at who I was when I was 15 years old, in terms of my mental health, in terms of my confidence. And you look at who I am now. I mean, I never in a million years dreamed that I would have the life that I have now. And it's a great life that I have. Now, at this point, I mean, it's complicated. It's a long, complicated story I'm not going to tell tonight. But, I owe a large amount of where I am to being part of mass movements. Mass movements are a good thing, and mass movements are necessary. And, if it wasn't for the labor movement, everyone would be a lot poorer, right? And if it wasn't for the civil rights movement, things in our country would be very, very different. And, you think about Christianity. Christianity was a mass movement. And it's funny because I even go into history. I read the book of Jeremiah from the Christian Bible. Go to the Old Testament, read the book of Jeremiah. What's it about? It's about a mass movement. That's what it's about. It's about a mass movement. And that in the kingdom of Judah, there was a guy named Jeremiah who was not a priest. To be a priest, it was hereditary. You were born into it, right? Jewish people whose last name is Cohen or Cohen or Coin, that's because they're descended from the Jewish people that were priests, And if you were not born into that family, you were not allowed to be a priest. And Jeremiah was not a priest. Jeremiah was an ordinary guy who sincerely believed in the religion of Judaism, which was the state religion that everybody believed in. But he saw that there was a huge amount of corruption in the kingdom of Judah, and that they were using loopholes in the Hebrew law to force poor people to work as slave laborers. And that the rich people were gathering up in the mountains and practicing human sacrifices. They were burning infant babies alive because they thought that a god called Moloch or a god called Baal would give them good luck if they sacrificed one of their children. And they were having wild sex orgies at the same time that they burned infant babies in these demented rituals they were doing up in the mountains. And at the same time, the widows and orphans, who the Hebrew law said had to receive protection, they were being left destitute. And you saw homeless widows and homeless orphans along the side of the road begging all the time because they weren't being cared for. And so Jeremiah, as a sincere believer in the Jewish religion, formed a mass movement. And he put on sackcloth, right? And he went around saying, if we don't change our ways, we will lose our country, right? If we don't change our ways, God will destroy us, is what he was saying. But what he was saying was actually pretty profound if you look at it. What he was saying is that if we don't change our ways, we won't be strong enough as a country to repel an invasion. Because if the poor are mistreated, if there's widows and orphans starving on the street, if the rich people are up in the mountains worshiping other gods and having sex orgies and burning babies, when the foreign army comes and invades, we're not going to be able to unify and repel the foreign invader, right? That the social contract of ancient Judah was the Torah, and that they had gotten away from the Torah. And the Torah was a brilliant piece of organizational technology. It says we're only going to worship one God. It says we're going to follow all of these laws. It's a brilliant work of, whether you believe it's divine or not. I want this to be accessible to everybody, no matter what your religion. If you look at the Torah, there's a reason that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are the main religions of the world today. The Abrahamic faiths that are based on the Torah persist even to today, because the Torah is a brilliant piece of organizational technology. If you are building a country, especially in the conditions that one was building a country 5,000 years ago, and you want to build a country very effectively, the Torah is a pretty good piece of technology. It says we're all going to worship one God, not separate gods. It says we're all going to rest on Sunday. It says you can't have sex outside of marriage, so there's no confusion about who's having sex with who and whose kid is whose. It's got some pretty basic things that are pretty good for holding a country together. And it says widows and orphans have to be taken care of. It says you cannot, you cannot use people as cheap slave laborers, right? It's got some pretty basic rules in it that are pretty good for running a society. And if you follow those rules, you can have a country that is strong enough that when a foreign army comes in and tries to conquer you, you'll all be together and you'll defeat the foreign invader. There you go. And Jeremiah was walking around the kingdom of Judah saying, we're not following these rules. We are not following these rules. And as a result, our country is coming apart. Our country is coming apart. And we are all going to be conquered. That's what he was saying. And one thing that he did is he wore a yoke. The oxen that would plow the fields, they wore yokes. So as an act of guerrilla theater, he put on a yoke and he started walking around with a yoke on, saying, look at me. We're all going to be conquered, and we're all going to be wearing a yoke like oxen if we don't start treating the poor and orphans better, right? And he put on sackcloth, and he was calling for them to get back to the organizational technology that held the kingdom of Judah together. And people didn't like that. And the priesthood especially didn't like it. And they said, who is this guy to be talking about religion? We're the priesthood. We're the ones that are supposed to be talking about religion. Well, Jeremiah said, you guys are corrupt. You're giving the rich people permission to have their orgies up in the mountains. You're helping them find loopholes in the law to use people as slave laborers. You're letting people get away with not feeding the widows and orphans. And in fact, the main thing that Jeremiah did was he would assemble crowds of poor people outside the temple of Jerusalem to protest against the priesthood and condemn them. And he said, he shouted at the priesthood, he shouted at the temple, he said, you have turned our father's house into a den of thieves. And he built a mass movement. That's what Jeremiah did. And if you read, he built this mass movement. And he did it for a while, and the priesthood really hated him. But then there was a king named Josiah who agreed with Jeremiah and said, you know what, if we don't follow and so the king Josiah made Jeremiah one of his advisors and promoted Jeremiah. So Jeremiah's movement grew by leaps and bounds. But then Josiah died and they got a new king. And that new king was a guy who liked the sex orgies and liked the human sacrifices and all of that. So the new king that came in, he persecuted Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was flogged and given a public whipping. And Jeremiah was banned from ever getting married. And Jeremiah's own family had to denounce him publicly and excommunicate him from the family. And Jeremiah endured horrific persecution. But then what happened? Babylon invaded the kingdom of Judah, and Israel was not able to effectively defend itself. Why? Because all the poor people were hungry, and all the widows and orphans were begging on the street, and all the rich people were too busy up in their mountains, enjoying their huge mansions built by slave laborers and having sex parties and burning children and sacrifices. And when the army of Babylon invaded the kingdom of Judah, well, they lost. And so Jeremiah fled from Judah to Egypt. And in Egypt, there was somebody named Baruch, who was a scholar who could read and write, right? Jeremiah could not read and write. He was illiterate. He had no education. He was just an ordinary guy. That's why the priesthood couldn't stand him out there preaching. And so Baruch, who was a scribe, wrote down all of Jeremiah's sermons, which were poetic. They rhymed. In the book of Jeremiah is all the sermons of Jeremiah. And the book of Lamentations, right, is also, Jeremiah's poems, his sadness about seeing his people conquered, right? And his crying, his weeping, that seeing his own people be conquered and wishing that they had just repented and promising them that at some point they would be able to throw off the yoke of their oppressor. And I look at Jeremiah and I say, that's a mass movement, right? Take all the religion out of it, right? Maybe it's just about social technology holding society together and all of that. But these people that condemn mass movements, right? What would they say? They would say, oh, Jeremiah was a big loser, right? Why didn't he just become a priest like anybody else? Well, he couldn't. He wasn't born into it. He wasn't born into it, right? He couldn't, and I bet Jeremiah was just in it for self-gain, right? He just wanted to be famous. He just wanted to be popular. So he's out there preaching in front of the temple. Well, was what he was saying correct? Yeah. Oh, Jeremiah and his followers, they just wanted to blame everyone else for their problems, right? They didn't want to admit that they weren't good enough. So they blamed the rich people and they blamed the priesthood and they blamed and condemned everybody else. Well, should they have been using poor people as slave laborers? Should they have been leaving the widows and orphans to starve along the street? Should they have ignored the cries of the poor? I think that Jeremiah was right. And generally the Abrahamic interpretation of the prophet Jeremiah in his life is that he was right, and that his mass movement could have saved the ancient kingdom. And I look at that and I think, okay, that looks like a mass movement to me. And that says to me that mass movements are good, right? And that whether you're talking about the labor movement, the civil rights movement, whether you're talking about mass movements are necessary, they are good. And that, nowadays we have a culture where there's no awareness of mass movements. On the one hand, there's not awareness of mass movements. And there's also wrecker culture where we're supposed to look at Jeremiah and say, well, that guy was starting a cult, right? He was having everyone put on sackcloth and he was going around preaching conspiracy theories against the government. And that guy was going around saying that the country was going to be invaded and crazy alarmist. That guy was a crazy cult leader. Well, that's what we would say now, isn't it? That would be the wrecker culture, right? Someone would join Jeremiah's movement and then get their feelings hurt somehow, and then they'd make a YouTube video. Oh my God, Jeremiah's movement, they all just worship him. They think he's like some kind of prophet, and that everything he says is right, and he's always complaining, and he wants you to just give your whole life to it and protest outside the temple all the time. He's a crazy cult leader. Oh my God. And it's like, people don't get that mass movements are something that humans do. They're almost like a corrective mechanism, right? When things have gotten, when things have gotten bad, right? And people are unhappy and society needs a fix up, we have a mass movement, right? When workers needed rights on the job, and they still do, one of the ways we respond is we built a mass movement. When the situation for Black Americans became intolerable and that caused divisions in the ruling class, we had the civil rights movement. Mass movements are a necessary thing. But we have a culture now that is very, very individualist, emphasizes individualism, where people don't know that mass movements are important, whereas at the same time, we have a culture where people think the way to be a great hero is to expose things. Look, I was listening the other day. They're trying to roll out Weird Al Yankovic. Do you know Weird Al Yankovic? Right? He's the guy who would, he's a parody artist, right? Weird Al Yankovic, right? He's done, he did, there was the hit song Gangster Paradise. He did Amish Paradise, right? His thing is he takes popular songs and he does spoofs of them. And Weird Al Yankovic hasn't had a hit in years, actually, right? His career is not going too well. Why? Because Weird Al Yankovic, and this is very interesting. I've heard many interviews with Weird Al Yankovic. They're promoting him like crazy right now. He's going to have his first tour in a long time. But the reason he hasn't had a hit in years is because of the fact that there's not songs that everybody knows anymore. Right? The way Weird Al Yankovic's career is there would be a song that everybody knew. You couldn't escape this song. It would be on the radio. It would be in the stores. It would be on television. There'd be a song that was everywhere. So he would take that song and spoof it, right? And that's how he became famous. But now we don't have common points of reference in the same way, right? Nowadays, we don't have the same types of songs, right? He did one song. He did the song Achy Breaky Song, because apparently the song Achy Breaky Heart, which was a country song from the 80s, was a song that you just couldn't not hear. And so he did a whole song making fun of that, right? If you play that song, that Achy Breaky Song, I'll blow up my radio, something like that. It was clever, it was witty. That was Weird Al Yankovic, right? But he can't do songs like this anymore because there are no common points of reference, right? There's not, a parody song industry. There's not songs that we all know anymore. So that's kind of pointing to the individualism of our culture. There's not common points of reference, right? There's not, and that people are much more individualistic. And we have been inculcated with a phobia of mass movements. And that's what Khrushchevism is about. Read my book, Khrushchevism, A Study in Psychological Warfare. What Khrushchev did with his speech condemning Stalin, that was a huge gift to a new form of anti-communism, liberal anti-communism. Classical anti-communism was conservative anti-communism, right? Opposition to communism on the basis that it's atheistic, opposition to communism on the basis that it is, is a destructive movement that's tearing apart society, right? That was classical anti-communism. But amid the downfall of McCarthyism, you saw the beginning of liberal anti-communism, the rise of liberal anti-communism, right? Which was Eric Hoffer and his book, True Believer, that says mass movements are inherently bad. And, it was, you had the book, The God That Failed, which is a book written by ex-communists about how communism, they thought it was God, but it failed, and it was the God that failed. And then Khrushchev got up and gave his speech about Stalin on the cult of personality and its consequences. And that opened the floodgates to a situation that we are in now, where people have a phobia of mass movements. And that is really weakening our ability to fix things in our country. There are a lot of things in America that are really wrong, right? If we do not get out of this globalist imperialist system, if we don't join the new world, this country is going to crumble from within. And I don't want that to happen, right? The fall of Rome was bad. Rome was bad, yes. But Julius Caesar had a plan to save Rome, to make Rome multipolar, to build up the various city-states, to make it so the empire wasn't centered around one city. Julius Caesar could have transitioned Rome to be more sustainable, but Julius Caesar was stabbed to death, and Rome deteriorated. The Republic fell, and eventually Rome fell, and Europe really, really got worse after the fall of the Roman Empire. It took 1,100 years for Europe to be at the same population level. The fall of Rome led to societal chaos and instability. I don't want that to happen to America. I want America to transition to joining the new world, to be multipolar, right? We need a multipolar world where we trade with Russia and trade with China, and we build countries up, and we have a pro-growth economy. We cannot have the old colonial British Empire system any longer. It just doesn't work. And I want our country to change, and I want our country to get better and move toward a multipolar world and move toward an economy that invests in human labor power and human creativity and communities and families, not war, death, and destruction. We need an economy based on physical economy and real economic growth, paved roads, technological innovations. That's the kind of economy we need, not Wall Street derivative ripoff schemes, not accumulation through destruction, profit from war, profit from drug addiction, profit from prisons. We need a physical economy, pro-growth, pro-humanity economy. And we need, in order to have such an economy, we need a government of action that will fight for working families. That is what we urgently need in this country right now. And I am committed to building a mass movement to make that happen. And I will just tell you right now, herein lies the rub, okay? Here's the rub. In the 80s and 90s and 2000s, being involved in a mass movement was very much a form of entertainment, right? It wasn't that during the Vietnam War years. There's an older woman who was a Vietnam activist, and she told me the reason that we didn't have any of the bullshit we have now in activism was we all desperately needed the war to end. And there's a woman, someone else, was a woman too, but there's men who've told me this. That the reason that the Black liberation movement of the 1960s, they were able to get so much done was they all desperately needed the situation to change, right? In the 80s and 90s, joining mass movements stopped being about, I desperately need to achieve the goal. And it became more about, I'm interested in obscure topics. I know about this issue that no one else knows about. It became kind of an indulgence of ego, and it became kind of an intellectual intrigue. I'm going to go to the rally to learn about this, to get literature, books, pamphlets I can't get somewhere else. I'm going to show how smart I am by getting involved in this issue no one else knows about. And, unlike during the Vietnam War years where they desperately needed the war to end, unlike the Black liberation movement that desperately needed things to change for Black Americans, getting involved in the movement became kind of an intellectual exercise. And now we live in an age where, number one, people don't have to join a movement to get that information, right? I mean, if you want to get books about obscure political topics, you can go to Amazon. They carry everything. If you want to learn about obscure political topics, there's podcasts on everything. You don't have to go to the rally or the convention or the conference to learn about the obscure politics. You can just, get it from the comfort of your home. And number two, you can't afford it. Right? Everyone's living standards, the amount of money people have is going way down, right? People can't afford it. There's not good paying jobs. So people can't afford it and they don't need it to get the intellectual stimulation. So as a result, people are just not forming mass movements as much, right? In addition to the cultural problem. But here's the thing, right? And Kinkle is in the chat. She's like ahead of me. It's gonna turn the corner. All right, it's going to turn the corner. There's going to be a moment that I have been referring to as strategic equilibrium. And that will be when conditions get bad enough that people once again are desperate for things to change. That's going to be the turning point. There will come a time where mass movements will emerge again because of the fact that people have no choice. It won't be an intellectual exercise. It will not be an ego. Look how much I know. It won't be. People will join mass movements because they desperately need things to change, because the economic and political situation in the country will be intolerable. And we're a couple years away from that. And the problem is that if we don't have an apparatus built, if we don't have structures in place to deal with that, when that comes, I don't know who's going to lead those mass movements, but it ain't going to be anybody good. It's not going to be anybody good. I can tell you that much. It'll be people representing the forces that already have wealth and power in our society, and it's going to be bad. We got to lay the foundations for strategic equilibrium and for the moment where, even though people have been inculcated with wrecker culture, even though people have been inculcated with a phobia of joining mass movements, people will have no choice. And their conditions will be bad enough that they have to join mass movements. And what I am struggling to do now with the Center for Political Innovation is we have got to lay the foundations of the structures that can exist when, once again, conditions cry out for a mass movement, when there is no choice. And that's what we're struggling to do with CPI. And it's not easy. It's very, very difficult, right? We're transitioning. We are in a period where the kind of mass movements that I came up in, where it is about intellectual intrigue, it's about ego, it's all of that. People can't do that anymore. They don't need to do it. They can't afford to do it. And we're getting close to the turning point where suddenly people will need mass movements out of desperate need. We got to be ready. We got to be ready for that turning point. We got to be ready for that turning point. So please come to our event in New Jersey. Please come. Don't come because you want intellectual stimulation, though it will be very stimulating. I'll be giving a speech, all kinds of new material. You'll be meeting all kinds of new people. Please come. And don't come because it's an ego thing. You want to be proud of yourself. You should be proud of yourself and all that. Come because you understand that we're building the ark. The flood is coming. We got to build the ark. We have got to build the ark. The flood is coming, and we need to be ready when the flood comes. You know, I just want to give a kind of a side note here. You know, I've been talking to different people about communist groups, right? About different communist groups that exist in America, right? And there are generally three types of communist groups in America, right? You have the mainline Communist Party, you have Trotskyite organizations, and then you have anti-revisionist organizations, right? The Communist Party USA was the main communist group affiliated with the Communist International. And basically what the CPUSA deteriorated into in the 1960s is they're basically lobbyists. Their job was to go out and do whatever the Democrats are doing, campaign for the Democrats, be mainstream regular labor unionists if they were in labor unions. But most of what they did was just campaign for Democrats and do it in a way that it was kind of made clear to the Democrats who they're campaigning for. We are communists, so you should be nicer to the Soviet Union. They were lobbyists for the Soviet Union, basically. Now I wouldn't even call them that. Now they're just kind of placeholders. But that's what the Communist Party USA started at, was like in this late Cold War. Then the Trotskyites, they're on the campuses, right? And they're building the anti-war protests. They might do labor work here and there, but they build anti-war protests. They have conferences. They sell books. They sell magazines. They're very visible, and it's very much an intellectual, be part of our movement. Anti-revisionism, though, right? The remnants of the new communist movement of the 1970s, right? I wrote a book about the new communist movement of the 1970s, which I find fascinating. The NCM, right? And a lot of anti-revisionist groups, not all of them, what they ended up doing was forming kind of community organizations that engage in community activism, so to speak, right? In a very kind of secret and discreet way, providing services, helping, and they don't go around talking about being communists, but they engage in, activism around the material needs of certain low-income communities, right? And they have a base of people that kind of rely on them. And a lot of those groups are pretty much defunct because the people that doing it are just old. I mean, these people are very old. But it's like there's a couple groups. Like, for example, there's something called the League of Revolutionaries for a New America. And it was started by Nelson Peary. And when I was in Detroit, I knew them because they ran the National Welfare Rights Union. And in Detroit, if you are applying for food stamps, you would go to their office and pay like $5 basically, and they would help you apply for food stamps and help you fill out the forms in a way that you got the most food stamps you could possibly get. Right. And that was kind of what they did. Right. It was a group that kind of enabled people to get government assistance and helped people to get government assistance. Right. And it was run by people in the League of Revolutionaries for a New America. And I believe they also run the National Coalition for the Homeless. They also run the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, and they're very quiet about their communist politics, but they run these kind of groups. There's another group that is much more infamous. They have a very bad reputation. They're called the National Labor Federation, or NATLFed. They're widely accused of being a cult. A lot of them went to prison or whatever, but they run these kind of like labor-oriented, nonprofits, the California Homemakers Association, the Eastern Service Workers Association, and they do kind of community service projects for low-income workers, and they would never tell you that they're communists. They're very discreet. In Chinatown in New York City, there's a lot of nonprofits among the Asian American community. There's CAV, the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. There's Asian Americans for Equality. And a lot of them were started by the Communist Workers' Party, which was an old Maoist group. Now, I think most of them don't believe in communism anymore. But when they were started by, anti-revisionist communists. And there's something called the Beloved Community Center in North Carolina. It's kind of a church that also does social services, and the pastor at it is a former member of the Communist Workers' Party. And that a lot of the anti-revisionist communist groups, they started kind of community service organizations that they controlled. And some of them are still around, but you would never know they're communists. They kind of exist in the shadows. And at this point, I think a lot of them are no longer communists. I think most of them are, I don't know about the Beloved Community Center, but, maybe somebody from North Carolina can tell me. Are they still communists at the Beloved Community Center? I don't think they are. They probably are just a liberal church at this point. CAV, Committee Against Anti-Invasion Violence, they're not communists. They may have been when they started years ago, but now they're just kind of an Asian American nonprofit that does community work in Chinatown. Asian Americans for Equality is definitely not communist. They support Israel. They're just Democrats, right? Margaret Chin, who was on the New York City Council for years, is one of them. She's not a communist. So a lot of these groups are not even really communist anymore, right? They've kind of shed their communist ideology or whatever. But there was a level of awareness when these groups were started, right? As the new communist movement was declining, a lot of them went into that. Because they understood on some level, they had more of an accurate understanding of what a real communist movement would look like. It would be a group providing services to people, right? And they knew what the Chinese Communist Party had done in order to come to power. They knew what groups in Nicaragua and groups in Latin America do and all of that. And that if you look at what what League of Revolutionaries for a New America has tried to do, if you look at what NATLFed has tried to do, if you look at what Asian Americans for Equality or CAV has tried to do, or at least was doing when they started, that will give you a much more accurate understanding of the kinds of organizations that are actually capable of building real mass movements in the moments where mass movements are necessary. And that doesn't mean these groups aren't crazy. They are. And most of these groups have a relationship with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is almost protecting them. So even if they still think they're communists or whatever deep down, they're not anti-imperialist because the Democrats are more pro-war. They have Trump derangement syndrome. They're lost. But the new communist movement and like the remnants of it when it collapsed, the kind of nonprofit culture that came out of it, of kind of building groups that perform services in communities with the intention of kind of building a base, that is probably a more accurate attempt, at least, to build something like a real mass movement, what a real mass movement would be, and what could actually become relevant in a time of crisis. And that's worth being aware of. And so I just wanted to end my opening remarks for tonight on that note. Hope this was insightful. Names and locations, folks. It's just a little after midnight. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Joshua Tree, Kinkle, Jenny in Cincinnati, Red, Axis in Ottawa, Jacob in Wisconsin, Genghis Khan in Mongolia, Broadway, North Carolina, Jacob in Wisconsin, Jane, good to see you, Jane, John McCarthy in Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, I actually for real, very good, Foe versus Oklahoma City, all right, names and locations. Oh, no, your name is Fovus in Oklahoma City. Okay. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Eric from Texas. Good to see you, Eric. Good to see you. Good to see you. Always good to see you. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Mr. Lovelow in California. Bobby in Wisconsin. The South, USA. Good to see you. Good to see you. Well, it is late, so I am just going to answer questions tonight. Not going to play music, not going to ramble on, but I'll be back. I'll probably be back tomorrow night. You know, one of the things about the winter, in the winter, it's much harder for me to get up in the morning, and then I want to stay up all night, and neither of those things are good. I don't know what it is. I went to the gym today. I worked out, which is really good for me in the winter. I'm really glad I'm doing that. First of all, I kind of stopped going to the gym for a bit, but I started in the last week, and it's been really a great thing to do. You know, and it's really waking up my body in the wintertime. And, you know, we're building for our big important event in January. I hope that you will join us at our event in January 11th. It's going to be a great event. Here's the information. Here's the Eventbrite where you can register. But please register and join us. It's going to be a really, really important gathering to kick off the new year. Anyhow, all right. So I am going to start answering people's questions, right? That's what we're here to do. All right. So Richard Unanimous says, if immigrants are taking jobs away from Americans or lowering wages, not saying this true, do you support visas for immigrants that are willing to testify against smuggling gangs or employers who pay them illegal wages and violate the standards, repurposing ICE to legalize non-criminals? I think that's a brilliant idea, Richard. I actually think that's a great idea. And one of the main issues I have with what ICE is doing is it's making immigrant communities terrified to cooperate with law enforcement. Right? It's not something I would have said when I was a regular communist, because you're supposed to hate the police or whatever, but I don't hate the police, you know, and that actually, you know, part of the reason that you want to have immigrant communities not terrified and in the shadows is so that you can go after, if you can go after the criminal gangs, right? And that you can make employers pay decent wages, and you can stop MS-13 from setting up shop in immigrant communities. So yeah, I think that is a great idea, right? First of all, and also, you know, are they lowering the wages of American workers? That's true. That doesn't mean the answer is to demonize immigrant workers, etc. But yeah, it is true. It is true that because of the inflow of immigrant labor, it is a lot harder. Look, electricians in New York City don't make anywhere near what they used to make. Why? Because there's a lot of people from elsewhere who will do it for a lot cheaper. And, that's not the fault of immigrants. That's the fault of, the fact that we have a global economy, et cetera. And that means that we need to, build a movement where people have what they need to survive and wages are decent, et cetera. But yeah, it is a reality that unfortunately the flow of mass migration has led to a situation where workers everywhere get lower pay, and it's not good. And, we have a high-tech, low-wage economy. It's all the problems I talk about, tendency of the falling rate of profit, overproduction, all of that. And there you go. There you go. Now, John McCarthy says Medea Benjamin has the right idea. Instead of just denouncing Trump or defending him, we should push him in the right direction and warn him that Marco Rubio is sabotaging peace. And John wrote a great statement on behalf of CPI. It's on our website. Yeah, fire Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is from the Miami Mafia. He is a warmonger. He is trying to push Trump in a bad direction. Get rid of little Marco. Yeah, it's a great statement from John McCarthy, and Medea is absolutely right. And that, yeah, if you just stand on the sidelines and scream shrilly against Trump, you will have no influence whatsoever. There are good people in the Trump administration, or better people in the Trump administration, like Tulsi Gabbard, etc. There's hope for peace here. Trump has been a real disappointment in a lot of ways, but with Kamala Harris, it would have been a lot worse. There is no question about it. It would have been a lot worse. Now, Penny says, today, the Union of Sahel States denounced Nigeria for violating airspace with their flights, and they vowed to shoot down any future violators. Meanwhile, the Ivory Coast is taking steps to mend relations with Burkina Faso. Yeah, well, in Benin, there has been an anti-imperialist military junta that has taken power, and Nigeria is now bombing Benin on behalf of France, basically, to try and get France to have control over Benin. It's very bad, and yeah, the Union of Sahel States doesn't approve, right? Because they see this as a colonial action. So there you go. I mean, and yeah, that Nigeria should not be bombing Benin, and that their military activities is not coming from a good place. Now, Penny also sent a video of Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader. So it's when he met with Manuel Macron. So let's put that on. We'll put that video on. And yeah, this is the video that Penny sent.
我每次到这里来啊，我都感叹我们的这个先人这种智慧，深谙我们这里的山川形势，把握水利规律，因地制宜，乘势而为，可以说是巧夺天工啊！人与自然的这种天人合一啊，非常伟大。而且这样的一种精神呢，还扩展到我们各个方面。这是治水，我们的话呢，治国理政也可以啊，从中受到启示，做出一些非常正确的事情。
Well, there you go. I will say Macron has some crazy eyebrows. Look at those eyebrows. I mean, look at that with the sideburns and the eyebrows there. That Macron, I did not realize Manuel Macron. Wow. I mean, that is some serious hair he's got going on there. Sorry, I feel like I'm a fashion critic or something, but yeah. And then we did have one Rumble rant from Hempcar. He said, and he's pointing me toward a Hillary. Oh no, two. Hempcar sent two Rumble rants. The second one was about Hillary Clinton's emails, where someone says, with fingers crossed, the old rabbit foot out in the box in the attic, I will be sacrificing a chicken in the backyard to Moloch. That just sounds like the person is trying to do everything they can for good luck, right? It's like an expression, like a rabbit foot or whatever. I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff in the Hillary Clinton emails that is weird, and I'm not saying that. I mean, as I've said before, I feel like the rich, if you look at Bohemian Grove and you look at the Skull and Bones, there's an element of like, they're not literally worshiping Satan. They are philosophical irrationalists, and they think people that believe in right and wrong are fools. And so it's like a joke. They like to mock and taunt those who do believe in right and wrong. That is my assessment. That particular passage you sent there, it looks like a figure of speech. It looks like he's saying with good luck. He bought the eyebrows at the same store John Bolton bought his mustache. There you go. And then he says, I've long thought the 1999 Memphis court case proving the U.S. government killed Martin Luther King should be sent door to door in black neighborhoods. Coretta Scott King said it should be shared as widely as possible. So yes, in 1999, the Martin Luther King Jr. family won a settlement from the U.S. government, arguing U.S. government complicity in the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, that fact, seems to give a lot of credibility to the belief that the U.S. government killed King, which at the time was just assumed, right? Mao Zedong wrote a statement about the death of Martin Luther King, which I guess I can put it on here. It's worth reading. Statement, death of MLK. And if you read the statement that Mao Zedong wrote, he basically just assumed that the government killed King. I mean, there was no question about it. It's called A New Storm Against Imperialism. And it was a couple days after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Mao Zedong wrote a statement, and in that statement, he said the U.S. government killed Martin Luther King. I mean, and it wasn't like he was saying a profound thing. He said that's what they did. And there was just widespread, I mean, at the time, everyone kind of assumed the U.S. government had killed Martin Luther King. That was just assumed. So, there you go. And the fact that the King family won settlements, the fact that the guy who allegedly killed MLK, right? Who there's a couple people who say he wasn't the shooter or whatever. But the fact that the guy, James Earl Ray, was in France, he was apprehended in France. That's pretty weird. The other thing that's interesting is I guess James Earl Ray was part of the Friends of Rhodesia Club, which was like white supremacists who were opposing the liberation of Zimbabwe. And he was like raising money for the white farmers of Rhodesia to fight the black settlers. And that there was one witness to the shooting. I think there was more than one, but at least one witness to the shooting said that he was not the shooter. And then there was a very famous comedian, a black comedian, who would always look at the very famous picture, right? Right. There's the very famous photo, right? It was taken right after the shooting. And here, I'll put it on the screen. And I forget his name. He was a very famous African-American comedian activist who I met once. I can't remember his name, but he would always talk about this photo, right? And he would always make this point. Hold on, let me find the photo so I can put it on the screen. Onerous duties. I'm joking, but he would always take this photo, right? The famous photo of the MLK shooting. He would always take this photo. Where is it? Why is it not? Okay. Here it is. All right. Here's the famous photo of the MLK shooting. And he would always say, why are they not ducking? Dick Gregory. Yes, Dick Gregory, the famous African-American comedian. He would always say, why are they not ducking to see if there's going to be another shot? That's what he would always say. Why are they not ducking, right? MLK has just been shot. They're pointing to where the sniper rifle was. Why are they not crouching down to avoid getting hit? Right. That's what he would always say. I've always thought that was a good point. Some people have said to me that's actually not a good point, right? I've said that actually there's a reason that they were not doing that. Like they opposed the photo so that people would know where the shot came from or something. It was after it had been cleared or something. I don't know. But that's what Dick Gregory would always say. We got a couple more minutes here. Maybe we can put Dick Gregory on. Dick Gregory. I actually got to meet him at a protest to support Lynn Stewart, the lawyer who was imprisoned. I went to a rally to support Lynn Stewart, and Dick Gregory showed up. Let me see if there's a brief clip of Dick Gregory comedy that I can put on. He was a very famous African-American comedian who was kind of an anti-imperialist. And he was also a skeptic of the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, here's a quick interview he did. Comedian Dick Gregory. This is a local TV bit he did. We'll put that on. And then if no one has any more questions, that'll be our night. Because it is late, but, and I do want to not get my sleep schedule completely out of whack, right? Working from home, that'll, throw your sleep schedule off. That's a very good point. That is a very good point, Christina. Very, very good point indeed. But yeah, we'll put Dick Gregory on and right. All right. Okay. All right. Comedian Dick Gregory.
Congress is coming back next week, and they're going to get involved with the marijuana thing. They talk about doing a joint session.
A comedian known for his political humor and activism, performing in Arlington tonight. It is so great to welcome Dick Gregory to Good Day. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, my brother. Peace and happy to you, and have a good holiday.
And Merry Christmas to you
Thank
as well.
Thank you.
So you've been doing stand-up comedy for a while now, about 60 years
yeah, I'm
or
85
so.
now.
Okay,
so.
okay.
Yeah.
So tell me, the experience of performing in front of a live audience, does it still feel the same as it did all those
years? It depends on what you're doing. I always thought until Kennedy was shot that nothing could take the place of humor. But every network in this country and most around the world canceled all commercials, all shows, and just played music. That's the only thing got us through. And I didn't realize that with children, you hear them children 2 days old, yeah, they singing, they're not talking. And so it's the music. Yeah. If you say your ABCs, you learn how to say it. One of the things with many African Americans and po folk, they sing the blues. Yeah. And so you pull that in. My baby done left me and all that kind of stuff. You're 9 years old singing that crap. And so again, I've been married like 58 years, and
yes,
I just said to my wife, if you want this to work, then it's about, can you be lovable, not love. Can you be lovable? And so you look at the holiday. Yes.
So when you're deciding what you're going to talk about each night in a performance,
I don't.
I was going to say, what is that process like then for you?
Just look at the news. Y'all make me $1 million. Okay, because when the ambassador was killed in Turkey the other day, now y'all don't see it. I see what you see, but you don't see it. He laid on the floor. He didn't move. I didn't see no blood. I didn't hear him holler. That's not normal. So there's something else going on that we don't know about, and that's what I walk up on the stage. I look at Trump for the last 6 weeks. Everybody with him got on suit coats like you. He's wearing a long coat. I said, what's happening to him that makes him so cold? And so when you sit and you look and you see it, I go to the zoo on December 21st. Wow, that's when the new equinox come in. The animals know it, but we here with PhDs and money, we don't feel nothing. It's very important. If you look at paganism, it's like Catholicism. We take paganism, and because it was a black thing, we say it's this and it's that. December the 21st, the sun dies, okay? And that's why they put a wreath on the door, but the wreath for the sun is red. And so then it comes back 3 days later.
Let me ask you, your first TV appearance, this was amazing to look at your history, on The Tonight Show, starring not Johnny Carson, but Jack Parr, Johnny's predecessor.
Yeah.
1961. Do you look back on all your years entertaining and performing? Do you look back on it with a sense of pride, or what is the feeling that you're still here?
Look, I got a knee here. You got an eye, a nose. For trillions of years, that's been in the same place. And so consequently, I look back at the audience. I see the audience change. I mean, if a plane crashed right now, when you walk over there, y'all be showing the pictures. So the mindset have changed.
Yeah.
The mindset have changed. The children
the
are
mindset
different.
So the audiences are different, you're finding.
The audience is different. Oh, yeah. Yeah, the audience is different. And if I don't see nothing on TV but the news. All over the world. I have top researchers that pull stuff and send it to me. Yeah.
All right. And I'm sure you'll be happy to elaborate on a lot of this today.
All right. Well, that's Dick Gregory. I mean, he was 85, he said there in the interview. So, wow. There you go. Now, Richard bought a coffee. He said, the Kurds, the Hmong, and the Darfur, how do they stoke ethnic conflicts and make fake genocides? I feel like the Kurds were definitely only existing to divide the left and full support Assad. Kissinger used them against Iraq in the 70s. How do you respond to people who say people are fleeing Venezuela and Maduro and Mugabe wrecked their economies? Yeah, the sanctions put both mildly. Okay, so I guess the first part, so communist groups, right? One of the defining positions of Leninism was support for national liberation, right? And that was, interestingly enough, that was probably why the Germans gave Lenin support against the Russian government, right? You know, we know that it was largely the Germans gave lots of money to Lenin and sent him back to Russia to stir up a revolution during World War I. And part of it was that he believed in breaking the various nationalities away from the Russian Federation. And after the Russian Revolution in Russia, they made a point of declaring nationalities. And this is very interesting. But like the Ukrainian language and the Russian language are very similar. And there was no written Ukrainian language at the time of the Russian Revolution. Ukrainian was just a way people in Ukraine talked, some of them, right? Most of them just spoke Russian, but there were some Ukrainians that spoke Ukrainian. And it was just a way that they spoke. And it was after the Russian Revolution, Lenin declared Ukraine is a nation. And he then had them create a separate written language for Ukraine. And it's like that. And many of the different nationalities throughout the Russian Empire were created. And that Bolshevism had this obsession with nations. And that then after the revolution, that translated to wanting to break apart the imperialist countries. In particular, they wanted to break apart Britain, for example. Northern Ireland was at that point still part of the British Empire. And so, you know, the Bolsheviks said that Northern Ireland should break apart because it's an oppressed nation within the borders of the United Kingdom. In America, they said black people constitute a nation, right? And they called for the independence of the Black Belt. You know, the Black Belt South. And this was actually the Communist Party's election campaign poster, in 1932. It was this poster. Let me put it on the screen, right? And it was vote communist, equal rights for black people everywhere. Here, I'll find a better high-res version of it. And then it had a map of where the independent black republic would be, self-determination for the Black Belt. So I always joke that they should start a karate league so they can win the black belt. But anyway, I don't know. I like jokes like that, right? They should, they want the black belts. They ought to get into karate. But anyhow, here, I'll put the image on the screen as soon as it comes up. Just waiting for the image. Hold on. Why does it? Okay. Here we go. All right. This is the famous Communist Party election poster. Equal rights for black people everywhere. Self-determination for the Black Belt. So because communists really emphasized national liberation struggles, part of Brzezinski and the pivot toward the late Cold War was the U.S. government supporting national liberation movements against communists, right? And that was a big part of the late Cold War, was the USA would support sections of communist countries breaking away or nationalities within communist countries declaring independence. And it got really confusing. For example, Ethiopia, right? The Kingdom of Ethiopia, it was the first African Christian nation, the first independent African country. This is the Kingdom of Ethiopia. It was run by Haile Selassie, Emperor of Haile Selassie. And that's who the Rastafarians worship, Haile Selassie, right? After in 1978, Haile Selassie was overthrown, and you had a communist government take power in Ethiopia. They were called the Derg, the Military Council, the DERG, the Derg. And the Derg was led by Mengistu. Mengistu, I forget what his first name was, but Mengistu, right? Mengistu was the leader of the Derg, and it was a military government. Well, Ethiopia has a couple different, oppressed nationalities within it. For example, there's Eritrea, right? And under Haile Selassie, Eritrea had been waging an armed struggle against the government of Ethiopia and against Haile Selassie. So after the Derg took power, the Eritrean resistance movement divided. And one of them made a peace deal with the Derg where they got regional autonomy, and the other one kept fighting. And so the Soviet Union had originally been funding the Eritrean resistance against Haile Selassie. But then when the Derg took power, which was a pro-Soviet Marxist government in Ethiopia, the pro-Soviet wing of the Eritrean resistance, signed a peace treaty and became, accepted autonomy. And so it was the Maoists, the Maoist communists. They kept fighting against the government of Ethiopia and against the Derg, and China was funding them, and they got funded by the CIA. And they eventually won, and they're now the government of Ethiopia, and they're still communists, I guess. I mean, they don't go around championing communism, but they're generally considered the North Korea of Africa. They're a very, very poor country, and the U.S. government hates them, and they are funded by North Korea and funded by China. And, it's ironic because the CIA originally supported them as a way of trying to break apart Ethiopia, and the pro-Soviet wing of the Eritrean resistance reconciled with the government. There are many cases like that around the world where, like, there would be a nationalist resistance movement in a country, and at some points it would be supported by the United States, and at some points it'd be supported by China, and at some points it'd be supported by the Soviet Union. A great example when you ask about the Kurds, right? And this is why I'm not a communist anymore. I'm an innovationist. I'm kind of beyond communism, right? So the Kurds are a great example, right? The Kurds in Turkey, right? Turkey is, a country, big country, but there's a national minority in Turkey called Kurds. So the Kurds, for a long time, they were Soviet communists, right? And Turkey was a US-backed military dictatorship. And the Kurds were, they were an oppressed nationality within Turkey, etc. Then the Soviet Union and Turkey reconciled. And so then the Kurds became Maoists, right? Well, the Soviet Union is sold out, and they said, well, that's Soviet revisionism. So they were still fighting Turkey, and they were getting backed by China. And then China reconciled with the Turkish government. So then they became followers of Enver Hoxha in Albania. And the Kurdistan Workers' Party was aligned with Enver Hoxha in Albania. And then in the 90s, communism went out of favor. Albania collapsed, and their leader was in prison. And their leader, who's still in prison, calls himself an anarchist and a follower of Murray Bookchin. But what is that about? What are the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the Kurdish, are they really anarchists? No. Were they ever Maoists? No. Were they even really Soviet-style Marxist-Leninists? No. They're Kurds, right? They're just a nationalist group for the Kurds, and they're anti-capitalist, probably because the Kurds, the Kurds are a, what do you call it? They're a largely working class group in Turkey. So if you're going to fight a movement for Kurds, just like the Black Panthers were a socialist group, they were fighting for black people, right? So the Kurds, when they were getting supported by the Soviet Union, they were Soviet communists. When they were backed by China, they were Chinese communists. When they were backed by Albania, they were Albanian communists. And now they're backed by liberal college professors from Sweden and Norway. And so they know how to put on a show. And so when the liberal college professor comes to Rojava or wherever, they show them the factory where every worker gets an equal amount of cookies or whatever. And, it's direct workers, democracy, blah, blah, blah. And, but it's at the end of the day, they're just Kurds, right? And the same for the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas do the same shit, right? The Zapatistas, for a while, they were Soviet communists and they're Maoists, and now they're anarchists, but they're really just Chiapas separatists. They're indigenous people, and they're socialists because they're fighting for their indigenous group. They want to break their indigenous group away from Mexico. And, they'll pander to whoever they pander to. But at the end of the day, they're just fighting for their nation, and they want socialism. They want a planned economy, right? And that all of this ideology, Maoism, Marxism, Leninism, Enver Hoxha, right? Trotskyism, even anarchism. There's elements of all of this that is useful, and there's elements of all of this that is bullshit, right? And at the end of the day, every country kind of finds its own way. Every country that is broken out of globalism, imperialism, has developed their own road to doing so and does it in a unique way. Okay. And if you're going around America calling yourself a Maoist, I mean, look, I've got Mao's little red book. I've studied Mao, but you can't be a Maoist in America. That's dumb. because Maoism is Chinese, right? This is a great book. It's an important political text to understand China and mass movements and all of that. But if you think you're going to make this, you're just going to copy this for America, you're delusional. And the same for Juche. Juche is really interesting for North Korea. But if you think you're going to apply Juche, you're going to build a Juche movement in America, you're crazy, right? When socialism or when America breaks out of globalism, imperialism, it's going to be a uniquely American form of it. And it will probably be led by people who've studied all these kind of movements and learned from all of them and blindly follow none of them. And if we're serious, that's how we need to talk. And that people who are Maoists or Hojaists or whatever, no, genuinely, these movements are just people trying to free their nation and adopting socialism to do so. And unfortunately, some of these movements have actually gotten into situations where they end up having to align with the imperialists. And in some cases, there are just nationalities that are being used, like the Uyghurs, right, are being used against the Chinese government. It's complicated. But yes, it was kind of revenge because the Soviet Union had a policy of supporting national liberation struggles against the West. The West turned it on them and started using it on them. And now it's just a game that is played. It is what it is. And that's not to say that some of these nationalities don't have legit grievances about how they were treated. And I don't want to poo-poo that, but yeah. And how do you respond to people who say people are fleeing Venezuela and Maduro and Mugabe wrecked their economies? Well, people in Venezuela have been going back. That's the story you never hear. Hundreds of thousands of people left Venezuela during the imposed food crisis in 2015. And they've gone back in big numbers. Venezuela, they've been going back. They never report on them going back. But all kinds of Venezuelans that fled to Colombia went back. All kinds of Venezuelans that fled to Ecuador have gone back. They never report on that because it's not part of the narrative. Just like they never report on people going back to North Korea, right? We always hear from people who fled North Korea. There are a number of people who fled North Korea who've gone back, and we never hear from them, right? This is the game. So if people leave America, does that prove that, there's American expats are at all-time high. You go to China, there's loads of Americans. You go to Russia, there's loads of Americans in Russia. Does that prove that America is an evil country? No. But if a Russian comes here, that proves Russia's an evil country. People leave and move countries all kinds of ways. Generally, if there's an economic hardship in a country, people leave. Generally, if the economy is going really well, people go there. But they only play these games. Look, under Gaddafi, millions of Africans were going to Libya because you could get a job there. The socialist economy of Libya was so prosperous, with the oil prices very, very high in the early 2000s. People from all over the African continent went to Libya. You never hear about that now, do you? Now people are fleeing Libya. Now they brought the free market back. Do you ever hear about that? No, because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? People die every day trying to cross the border to the United States from Mexico. Mexico is a capitalist country. Does that prove that communism is, or that capitalism is bad in Mexico? And, the number of people who flee to America from Cuba versus the number of people who flee to America from Mexico is very small. But if people flee to America from Cuba, it's because capitalism is bad. Capitalism is good. If people flee from Mexico, it doesn't mean anything. It's just they play selective games. The other thing that you have to remember, and this is an important thing about all of this, is that when you come to the United States, it is on the form. Are you a communist? If you say yes, you don't get to live here. So no immigrant can come to this country and go around saying communism is great, or they're going to send him back. So if people are like, oh, I talked to somebody from there, he told me it was horrible. Of course he did. Of course he did. Like, you think they're, and also this is America. If you go around saying communism is great, people are going to look at you like you're crazy, right? Even the communists in America don't think communism is great in Cuba. Most of the communists in America say that's not real socialism. That's fascist. Look, I am at my wit's end when it comes. I'm done talking about communism. I really am, right? We live in a country. So I am an anti-imperialist. I support people around the world that are struggling against imperialism and this globalist imperialist system. And I want a society where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. And that means breaking out of imperialism. That's what I want. According to all the woke people, I am a fascist. I am a fascist because communism means trans bathrooms and worker cooperatives and whatever. So the woke people all think I'm fascist. So I can't be one of them. Right? And among people on the right, they think that all the woke people are just the same as the communist governments around the world. And I'm at the point where I'm done having these conversations. I got a video that came up in my news feed today. Great God Almighty. I got a video in my news feed today about Nick Fuentes. And I started watching it, and it was telling me I should not like Nick Fuentes because he admires dictator and brutal mass murderer Joseph Stalin. And I was like, oh my God, that's what's wrong with Nick Fuentes. You know, it's like, I just politics in America is at an all-time low. And we just have to do our own thing and build our own movement. And communism in America has no meaning at this point. It used to be something that people thought was very, very bad and didn't know anything about. But now there are a bunch of people calling themselves communists who don't know anything about it and have no connection to actual communist governments. And I mean, we're just in a messy situation. It's a complete mess. I really, at this point, it is not productive to go around arguing with people about communism at all. It really isn't. It doesn't help anything. You know, the right are against communism, but they think communism is wokeism. And the left are also against communism, but they think they're the real communists, and they want to invade and bomb all the countries that have had anti-colonial revolutions. And then the countries around the world that are communist are not like they used to be. They've changed a lot. They have mixed economies. They are positive on religion, and they're not putting out that Trotskyite wrecker vibe. It's all a big mess. It's all a big mess. And we just have to build our own movement. We have to build the innovationist movement. Long live innovationism. We have to build the Center for Political Innovation. We have to just build our own movement, and that we can't get caught up because the arguments are not productive, right? Whenever you're arguing about what words mean, it's not a productive argument. I've learned that, right? If your argument is about what words mean, it's a waste of your time. I do not want to argue vocabulary with anybody. I want to argue policy. And that's the note I will leave you with tonight. Here we go. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.